Make sure your microphone is turned off, otherwise you'll be like lovely whispers. Right, let's be out here a moment.
Okay, welcome everybody. I'm sorry for the delay. It gives me great pleasure to kick off the new Shame and Medical History Seminar Series. This is the first outing for this collaboration, this coming together of the Shame and Medicine Project and the Centre for Medical History. We have got lots of talks planned, and but we're starting off with a very, very exciting and appropriate talk from Dr. Anne Hanley, who is currently a UKI Future Leaders Fellow.
Oh, here you go.
Quite nice, isn't it, now?
It's gorgeous. There you very quiet when you got here. And we were slightly worried because they had a problem the other day because they were tiles missing in the pool. And
No, I can close it. They're having a lot of trouble. Sorry about that.
If we click on stop sharing. Right. Okay. So if there's any questions at the end, you can just.
Yeah, we'll unmute her.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, Zhao will be host by then.
Right. There we go.
Okay, great. So Anne is working on a project that is going to map Britain's sexual health histories over a long period from the First World War to the AIDS crisis. So a big 20th century project. Anne is, I've known Anne for a long time. I've followed her career with great interest. She has written some really insightful pieces of work, and I particularly draw your attention. How am I doing this? To her book, which is called Medicine, Knowledge and Venereal Diseases in England, 1886 to 1916. But she also has an edited collection called Patient Voices in Britain, 1840 to 1948, which I'm right is it's not just historical, is it? It's
This is policy elements.
It has policy. I knew it did. Anyway, today she is promising to speak to us about shame, stigma, and sexual health with the title, I am polluted to the marrow, soaked in abomination. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kate. Please do mention in the comments if at any point you can't hear me, but it's a real pleasure to be here today. As Kate mentioned, I have been working with venereal disease or sexual health for a very long time. So it's always nice to start to present on new material. There are many places that we could start our talk today. We could start with Victorian and Edwardian hang-ups over sex, because they had many. Like the unshakable belief that no respectable woman had any business whatsoever knowing anything at all about venereal disease. We could start with the government's radical about-face after the First World War, when it tried, with dubious success, to break down the stigma that had plagued sexual health for so long. Or we could even start with the ways in which sexual health stigma among LGBTQ and minoritized communities was compounded by the violence of homophobia and racism. We'll be getting around to all of those things in the next hour, because they're all important chapters in the fraught saga that has been Britain's relationship with its own sexual health. But for now, our story opens in 1942. At the height of the Second World War, Mass Observation, a research organisation, surveyed residents in several London boroughs about this public health advertisement that had recently appeared in the Daily Mirror. 10 plain facts about VD outlined the dangers of syphilis and gonorrhoea, the telltale signs of infection, and the need for immediate treatment. It was part of the Ministry of Health's largest ever sexual health campaign. Alarmed by wartime infection spikes, the ministry was trying to counteract the hush-hush culture that it believed was undermining efforts to protect civilian health. But shockingly, this campaign didn't end with newspapers. In October, England's Chief Medical Officer, Wilson Jameson, addressed the nation, delivering the first BBC broadcast about venereal disease. And we can listen to a little bit of that now. For those of us joining online, the clip that we're listening to is available via this link on BBC Sounds.
And now, a few words about venereal disease, the two chief forms of which are syphilis and gonorrhea. Both these diseases are caused by germs that live in the human body and die very rapidly outside the body. They're contracted in the main as a result of irregular sexual relationships. But there's a large amount of such disease contracted quite innocently. Thus, an infected man may give the disease to his wife, and she, in her turn, may transmit infection to her unborn baby. The after effects of these diseases, if they go untreated, may be terrible. Babies born dead, children becoming blind, women unable to bear children, men and women suffering and dying from certain diseases of the brain and heart.
So, Mass Observation wanted to understand how ordinary people felt about this very public airing of a subject that was still very much hush-hush. Its interviewers had been warned to expect a full range of impassioned responses, from dismay that more wasn't being done to combat venereal disease, to visceral rage over such distasteful subjects being made acceptable for public consumption. One outraged man from Wandsworth fumed, "A bloody fine game, syphilis on your breakfast table. Can't they find some other bleeding way of advertising instead of putting it across like this? My wife was up in the air about it as if it was my fault." It is not a nice way at all, and I expect a great many people will be disgusted about it. Similarly, a woman from Chelsea, whom the interviewer described as coldly antagonistic, insisted that no one would answer such impertinent and insulting questions. She said, "You can't deal with a difficult subject in this ham-handed way. The point is you'll get no change out of a person who has got VD. They'll only feel, what the hell? It's no business of yours. And the ones that haven't will only be angry at you bringing up an unpleasant subject they have managed to shut their eyes to." So it seemed unlikely that anyone expected respondents to be quite as candid as this elderly man from Notting Hill Gate. As a young man, I caught it, and yours truly was very sorry for himself. Of course, I read many good books at the time, Macaulay and so on, but I was fleeced by doctors. They had every penny I had. I dared tell my father, a stern Victorian. It took 2 months, but I'm told this cure now takes 2 weeks. Is it possible? It doesn't sound possible to me. Or indeed, this younger man from Fulham. A good many people, I have been told, catch this disease through using the same lavatories and towels. How to get over this problem is a puzzle. I had a slight dose once, which I got from a typist, the last person you'd expect it from. But she was most troubled when I told her to go and get treatment, and was inclined to believe that I had given it to her. Several of my pals have had the same experience, and it does make you wonder where the origin starts. These tantalizing snippets of people's feelings about sexual health, and especially their candid disclosures of infections, are gold dust for historians, because despite concentrated government efforts across the interwar years and into the Second World War, venereal disease was still very much a no-no in polite conversation. And as a result, we don't have many records of people's personal experiences. As our lady from Chelsea vividly put it, no respectable, right-minded person will talk publicly about venereal disease, let alone admit to having it. And this was reiterated many times over by those interviewed by Mass Observation. Another woman from Chelsea told the interviewer that it's no good asking questions. Girls won't talk about it to strangers, only to someone they thought might help them. They certainly wouldn't answer a list of questions from an inquisitive stranger. Now, today, A diagnosis of syphilis or gonorrhea might be inconvenient, embarrassing, and even stigmatizing. Certainly, the rise of antibiotic-resistant gonorrhea has created new urgency for maintaining good sexual health. But for the most part, the profound fear over these diseases is alien to us. The idea that syphilis or gonorrhea could kill you or lead to your total social ruin is almost unimaginable. But for the Victorians and Edwardians, and even for people at mid-century, this was still very much their reality. Across the hundreds of interviews collected, we can see very clearly how Victorian morality, its double standards, its hypocrisies, was still shaping opinions and attitudes well into the 20th century. And given that invective, like these little cheap, loose-living girls, still feels all too familiar today, we'd be forgiven for thinking that not much had changed. But at the same time, we can see how things had begun to change. We can see the impact of the enormous developments that revolutionized sexual health during the 20th century. We can see how these changes began to affect the way that people thought about, talked about, and felt about sexual health. And herein lies a fundamental tension. On the one hand, public discussion of venereal disease was suppressed. Throughout the period we're discussing, it was not a fit subject for polite or respectful conversation. And as we've seen, it remained suppressed well into the 20th century, and indeed today. But on the other hand, venereal disease generated enormous fascination and scrutiny. It consumed the public's imagination, becoming a central plot device for novels, plays, and the early silver screen. As the literary critic Monica Pelshak-Franger observes, the socio-political and cultural potency of syphilis lay in the tension between its visibility and its invisibility. Andrew Smith describes it similarly as a disease and a metaphor for disease, both a medical problem and a trope for social and cultural degeneration. In other words, he says there was the reality of this disease and a cultural fear of it. And the same was true for gonorrhea. For much of our period, these two faces of syphilis and gonorrhea, the disease and the metaphor, were inextricable. And the tension this created fundamentally defined people's sexual health experiences. It left them in constant fear of exposure and ruination, of infecting others. It fed feelings of isolation, grief, and depending on how a person was infected, also perhaps feelings of betrayal. It's the inner nature of this turmoil and the fact that so few people felt able to leave written accounts of that turmoil that makes the job of historians just a little bit more challenging, just a little bit. So this is where non-traditional historical sources like fiction become so valuable. They lay bare the emotional and psychological trauma of venereal disease in a way that just does not survive in other types of written sources from this period. Few other diseases preyed so extensively on the Victorian imagination, and with good reason. We don't have comprehensive data for civilian infection rates before the First World War, but the Victorians and Edwardians firmly believed that venereal disease was out of control. And in light of recent historical research, this fear seems somewhat justified. Using available data from the time, historian Simon Schretter estimated that in 1914, the prevalence of syphilis and gonorrhea among men in their mid-30s was as much as 8.5% and 27.5% respectively. And he goes on to note that among the more affluent classes, as many as 1 in 3 bachelors were infected with syphilis or gonorrhea either before or at the time of their marriage, thereby posing a risk to their families. And it's this risk to the family and the resulting domestic chaos that became so compelling for writers and playwrights at the time. These works of fiction are important sources for patient-centered social histories of medicine. Their creative reconstructions of real-life struggles and internalized emotional worlds make them important sources to be considered alongside more traditional non-fictional sources. But it's up to us to draw these sources, these different sources together in a way that is sensitive and nuanced. Because when they are used thoughtfully, fiction allows us to access complex lives that otherwise are obscured in surviving records, which for the most part were written by health authorities, moral reformers, or institutional authorities. But there are, of course, ethical challenges to doing this. The political scientist Elena Chbotek insists that scholars must avoid visualizing experiences of our subjects by making interpretive leaps and engaging in evocative imagined scenarios that the personal testimonies only hint at but do not fully convey. In seeking to understand historical lived experiences of venereal disease, we become what Votage describes as curators of pain, tempted always to seek out the extremes of emotional, physical, or psychological trauma. So it's a constantly fine balance, comparing fictional representations that were often embellished for literary effect against what we know of real-life experiences from the snippets that survive to us in medical literature. Indeed, medical literature and fiction were genres that drew heavily from each other in the creation of stereotypes about venereal disease and its sufferers. Victorian writers commonly blurred the boundaries between medicine and literature, playing on popular plot devices like hereditary degeneration and disease transmission. Classic examples include Arthur Conan Doyle's short story Third Generation and Sarah Brand's New Woman novel To Henry the Twins. And these stories are defined by mental fragility, bodily corruption, despair, familial chaos, and social decay. They are littered with characters, desperately trying to keep up appearances as their private lives fall spectacularly apart. Characters forced to come to terms with degeneration and degradation that has been concealed behind a cracking facade of morality and respectability. And these stories gave a very public face to a very private problem. Doyle's ill-fated protagonist, Sir Francis Norton, has been tainted by congenital syphilis courtesy of his dissolute grandfather. Upon discovering this, he cries, "I am polluted to the marrow, soaked in abomination." And believing himself irrevocably damaged and socially ruined, Norton throws himself under the wheels of a horse-drawn carriage. And such tragic endings are also common tropes in these stories. After much anguish and recrimination, our benighted heroes usually die, either by their own hand or by the insidious consequences of their disease. But if we look past the melodrama, we see in these stories the same pathos, same anxieties and fraught personal relationships that real-world doctors recognized and navigated in their patients. Sarah Brand's Heavenly Twins is a good example of this. Like other New Woman writers, Brand was pushing back against the sexual double standard, contesting the firm Victorian belief, as I said earlier, that a woman's respectability hinged on her ignorance of sexual health. As a eugenicist, Brand believed that society's sexual hypocrisies were undermining the health and vitality of the British race by endangering the well-being of white middle-class women. In Brand's mind, this class of women, and only this class of women, were the guardians of the British race, and keeping them ignorant of the dangers of a diseased marriage was a direct route to degeneration. Now, there's a lot wrong with Brand's worldview, but embedded within a patriarchal social order and its institutions, venereal disease did carry very gender-specific sets of experiences and implications. And what do I mean by this? Well, for example, doctors whose fees were paid by husbands and fathers aided these men in withholding from wives the fact that they had venereal disease. But even if women were kept in the dark about the exact nature of their illness, it would not have escaped their notice that they were ill. Wilson Jameson in his BBC broadcast has already outlined these diseases, but common earlier stage symptoms include vaginal discharge, a blotchy red rash across the body, acute abdominal pain with swelling, swollen glands, and a burning sensation when passing urine. And women might even have been alerted by an inability to conceive or carry a pregnancy to full term. Or they might have been left with a generalized anxiety after a few deliberately ambiguous words from their doctor, because it would also not have escaped their notice that they were being subjected to embarrassing and painful medical procedures for which their husbands and doctors offered very little explanation. Indeed, Brand makes pointed use of this exact scenario. The benighted heroine Edith is married to a diseased aristocratic reprobate and is being treated without her knowledge for a venereal disease that he gave her. This is an extract from the text. The doctor again, Edith groaned. It's been nothing but the doctor and tonics ever since I have been married. What does he say is the matter exactly? Mrs. Beale asked. Mrs. Beale is her mother. All his endeavour seems to be not to say what the matter is exactly, Edith replied. Telling a Victorian woman that she had venereal disease would almost certainly imply that her husband also had venereal disease. Sorry, everyone, one moment. We're just admitting some more people.
While you're there, you're gonna make me co-host.
Are you not co-host? I thought you were co-host.
No, because
I'll make yourself co-host and then.
only the actual medical stuff to it. My name. Make
Yeah.
Right, thank you.
Apologies, everyone. Wait. Yes, so telling a woman that she had a venereal disease would almost certainly tell her, or imply at least, that her husband also had venereal disease, and that he had infected her. And according to doctors, this would constitute a breach of confidentiality, even if the husband wasn't actually their patient. In fact, before the First World War, doctors were very open about conspiring to keep women ignorant, arguing that doing otherwise would lead to marital conflict and would undermine men's authority. Interestingly, most doctors in this period were men. For example, the French venereologist, one moment. The French venereologist, Alfred Fournier, insisted in his seminal text, Syphilis and Marriage, that doctors would need to scheme and dissimulate constantly. And here's the longer extract from that textbook. In the vast majority of cases, the woman is ignorant of the disease which affects her, and it is your moral duty to deceive her in this matter by hiding from her the name and nature of her malady. And why? A young husband who has infected his wife will come to you, for instance, in the greatest anxiety and will commence the conversation thus. Doctor, a great misfortune has happened to me. I've had syphilis. I have been wrong enough to marry without being thoroughly cured, and I have given the disease to my wife. I've come to ask you to treat my poor wife, but keep her completely ignorant of the name and nature of her disease, for if she knew, I should be lost. There would be an end to her affection and to her esteem, and she should tell her family. Imagine the scene. Now, of course, you might think that this is just exaggeration, the literary effect. Well, as unbelievable as this may seem, the following is actual testimony from Dr. Armand Ruth, who was consulting obstetric physicians Charing Cross Hospital during his appearance in 1914 before the Royal Commission on Venereal Diseases in Britain. And it captures beautifully the heavy-handed paternalism with which women were contending. One of the commissioners asks him, if a married woman came to you and you discovered she had syphilis, would you tell her the nature of her disease if she asked you? And he answers, no. You would not, I never have. You do not think she has the right to know? She has the right to be treated for it. But she has not the right to know the nature of the disease. I think the doctor is bound to secrecy. And here again, we return to this excuse of confidentiality. If she asked herself, no, I don't think I would. Why not? She could be treated probably just as well without knowing. Of course, such a revelation would necessarily lead to divorce and whatnot, if you did. Even when women did know that they had a venereal disease, their emotional responses were mediated through male doctors' expectations of appropriate womanly behavior. For example, Fournier admired what he saw as the self-sacrificing stoicism of a patient who maintained an appearance of ignorance for the sake of the husband who had infected. So this is where fiction becomes so important for our purposes. Whereas Fournier and Ruth ironed out the complexities of female experience, authors like Brand gave voice and nuance to women's trauma, albeit a very specific group of women. Far from preserving her innocence, Edith's sexual ignorance leaves her vulnerable to a dissipated husband. In Edith, Brand provides what so much of the medical literature cannot: an articulate, female-oriented perspective on the day-to-day emotional and psychological impact of living with venereal disease. And it is rendered even more moving and confronting because society's rigid morality, its conspiracy of silence, denied Edith legal recourse, or indeed any mechanisms, for articulating her anger and betrayal. As Gran describes the situation thus: Edith had been robbed of all means of self-defense by the teaching which insisted that her only duty as a wife consisted in silent submission to her husband's will. Her intellectual life, such as it was, had stopped short, and only her senses had been nourished, and these were now being rendered morbidly active by disease. The mental torture was extreme, but she fought for her reason with the fearful malady valiantly, and all the time presented outwardly only the same dull apathy, giving no sign and speaking no word which could betray the fury of rage within. As we've seen, Dr. Zyphonier admired this sort of stoicism in women like Edith, and weren't seemingly interested in the emotional or psychological turmoil simmering beneath. Women in Edith's predicament might have suspected that something was seriously wrong, but they lacked the sexual knowledge, vocabulary, and social capital to articulate their concerns. Yet, as Gran reminds us, through the suffering of her other heroine, Everdeen, knowledge was no guarantee of health or happiness. Everdeen's first marriage reminds us that knowledge cannot guard against the expectations of a family whose principal concern is not the moral or physical health of their future son-in-law, but the material gains of a socially advantageous marriage. Forced into a marriage with a dissolute man, Everdeen spirals into hysteria. Her wide reading of medical textbooks has given her a pathological fixation on the dangers of syphilis. She begins to imagine that she has been infected. And even though her first marriage was unconsummated, she becomes convinced that her first husband's sexual vices have somehow imprinted themselves on her, and by extension, on the unborn child that she has conceived with her second, healthy husband. Here, Everdeen is showing clear signs of a condition that was called Syphilophobia, what doctors described as the insane dread of syphilis, or the unshakable fear that one had contracted syphilis. And like other phobias emerging in 19th century medical literature, Syphilophobia and its phenomenology was derived from the interplay of shame and fear, producing its own distinct pathologies. And in some people, like Everdeen, it's this dread of syphilis even led to the psychosomatic generation of symptoms. What is unusual about Everdeen is that she is a female syphilophobe. Syphilophobia was discussed far more widely in the 19th century than the 20th, and it was a condition that was thought to afflict mostly men. And this is something that doctors at the time attributed to the sexual double standard, which allowed men extramarital sexual liaisons, while at the same time giving them the knowledge and the vocabulary to articulate anxiety about the consequences of those liaisons. But even among men, a chronic lack of reliable information characterized their experiences. In a society that suppressed public discussion of venereal disease, reliable public health information was scarce, and this in turn fed conditions like syphilophobia. Happily, this began to change as we move into the 20th century, as reliable sexual health information becomes more readily available. At the same time, syphilophobia as a condition also began to slide out of use in British medical discourse. Nonetheless, the term syphilophobia slid out of use, while at the same time, a dramatic spike occurred in the numbers of people fearing that they had an undiagnosed venereal disease. So what caused this? Why was there this spike, even though syphilophobia was sliding out of use as a medical category? After the First World War, in response to the recommendations of the Royal Commission on Venereal Diseases, the British government set up something called the Venereal Disease Service. Rolled out 30 years before the NHS, the VD service was unparalleled in its ambition and scope. It was Britain's first national scheme of universal healthcare free of point of use. And by the 1920s, there were over 200 clinics across the country. Anyone could access any clinic in any part of the country, having walked in off the street or been referred by a doctor. Millions of people passed through these clinics, and even more were exposed to the groundbreaking public health campaigning that accompanied the VD service. And it was that campaigning, combined with freely accessible health services, that meant that many more people were, were becoming more aware of the dangers of venereal disease, and also now had the means to do something about it, to go and get themselves checked, and to get some peace of mind. Now, the assumption that sexual knowledge was immoral did persist well into the 20th century. We even see it today. We see it here in the mass observation interviews, such as this middle-aged woman from Wandsworth, who felt that the Ministry of Health's wartime propaganda created what she said was the wrong way of thinking in our younger people. Become curious, find out what it all means, and become debased through the knowledge. Nonetheless, people, young and old, were finding out what it all meant. And we know this because of the enormous numbers of people who attended new clinics either out of fear or anxiety. Women especially were attending in large numbers, bringing their children with them, many fearing that their husbands had infected them, and many anxious that they had unknowingly passed that infection to their children. Before I go any further, I want to say that the patient names that I'm about to use are pseudonyms. Their cases are taken from the admission registers of various hospitals and clinics, and collectively they give us a good idea of the enormous numbers of people from across the social classes who are coming into clinics because they feared that an unidentified or unknown rash or discharge might be venereal. So a few examples. In 1939, Ada, a middle-class housewife, presented with her 20-year-old daughter at Westminster Hospital's VD department. Both were diagnosed as NVD, which meant no venereal disease or a disease that was not venereal. Around the same time, Florence brought her 16-year-old daughter to the clinic, but they were not so lucky. Florence was diagnosed with acquired syphilis and her daughter with congenital syphilis. And infants as young as 2 weeks were also brought for precautionary examination, such as the case of baby Ronald, who also was diagnosed as NVD. Now, we can only speculate on the troubled relationships that may have led Ada, Florence, and Ronald's mother to suspect that they and their children have been put at risk of venereal infection. But what we can assume is that their clinic visits, like those of countless others during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, were prompted by the film and poster campaign that accompanied the VD service. Indeed, case notes from the Whitechapel VD clinic exemplify this trend. Alongside patient symptoms and other personal information, medical officers began listing the reasons that had motivated attendance. And many patients had been sent by their GP or they'd been transferred from the hospital. But most commonly, the motivating factor for attendance was advertisements. And here are a few of the more fabulous examples of public health posters that were acting as advertisements from this period. Alongside these sorts of posters, there were also theatrical VD health films, which acted as another method of increasing awareness of venereal disease and the new VD service. These films had very different plots from the fatalistic Victorian novels and plays that had preceded them, although they did deal with similar subjects. In the work of people like Brand and Doyle, innocent virgins had married degenerate reprobates, and they lived only long enough to watch their children succumb to the ravages of congenital syphilis. Or wholesome young men, like Francis Norton, who we met earlier, were felled in their prime by the emergence of a previously dormant taint. The interwar films were similarly melodramatic and similarly unsubtle in their messages about personal and collective moral hygiene. But unlike their Victorian predecessors, these films were generally optimistic. The 1936 film, Trial for Marriage, is a good example. Foolish young man, John Taylor, this strapping chap here in the dark blazer, falls in with a fast London crowd and is corrupted by Hermione Strange, the bad girl of Chelsea, and that's her there. Bored, lonely, missing his fiancée, John declares that he'd like to be wild again, and Hermione obliges, inviting him to a party where, having plied him with absinthe, she seduces him. Fearing the worst, John's cousin Henry, who conveniently is also a sexual health doctor, takes John to visit the hospital's venereal disease wards. As Henry explains to the senior surgeon who they just happened to bump into, John is really a jolly good chap, but he's got in with a fast gang, and I want to open his eyes a bit. And at this point, the plot descends into unsubtle dialogues on the dangers of venereal disease and the exceptionalism of Britain's new VD service. You can see a bit of it here. Henry says impassionedly, "You wouldn't get sights like this if people were compelled to come early for treatment." But the surgeon gently reminds Henry that it's a mistake to use force. Here in England, we pin our faith to persuasion, and to educating public opinion. Having seen firsthand in Henry's hospital the ravages of these diseases, John enters a period of acute self-recrimination. But importantly, the film promises eventual atonement. John's transgressions would have been morally unpardonable and medically untreatable only a few decades earlier, which is why all of our characters in the Victorian novels and plays meet such unhappy ends. But now in the interwar years, with a socialized health service and new methods of treatment and diagnosis, John's infection has become something entirely fixable with a prompt visit to the local BD clinic. The intention of these films was to normalize the clinics and to make health professionals who staff them seem more approachable. In these films, we see reflections on contemporary attitudes, as well as carefully choreographed efforts to try to change some of those attitudes. And although extramarital sex is still a no-no, the films are trying to break down some of the stigma around venereal disease so that more people might willingly come forward for examination and treatment. These films captured the inner conflicts of people suffering from venereal disease, presenting those conflicts as the byproduct of a society that was itself conflicted in its attitudes to sex and possession of sexual knowledge. So while awaiting his test results, John is so tormented that his guilt and anxiety play out in a surreal dream sequence in which he is on trial for criminally reckless conduct. In other words, the criminally reckless act of infecting his future wife. Although warned about the dangers of venereal disease and the wrongness of society's sexual double standard, he insists during this imaginary trial that his bad habits were an unavoidable consequence of inadequate sex education. But the judge is unconvinced, and just in case the audience harbored any lingering doubts, his closing monologue, the most hard-hitting in the film, made it abundantly clear that the consequences of sexual transgression were an unpardonable offense, and the implication is that we, as the audience, are meant to agree with him. And the judge says, the prisoner has sought to justify what he has done by referring to the principles of sowing wild oats. Now I am sure that no right-minded person would accept this for a single moment as an excuse. As regards falsely making the declaration of good health, the prisoner admits that he is to blame for studying his own convenience, instead of acting on advice of skilled medical opinion. Had you been ignorant, the fact that you did not realize what the results of your act would be might have been an argument in your favor. But you have the knowledge, were warned by friends and medical advisors, and was trusted by your wife. Your act is an unpardonable offense against the community. Waking from this surreal dream, John receives a letter confirming that he will indeed need lengthy treatment and that consequently his wedding must be postponed. But although the film ends without the much anticipated marriage, it's not fatalistic. The message is clear. Despite John's failings, he can be cured and live happily ever after, provided he gets the necessary treatment. John will not meet the same fate as Francis Norton because modern medicine, if not quite yet society, is on his side. Films like Trial for Marriage were really trying to break down the culture of concealment and stigma that has shaped Victorian and Edwardian experiences of venereal disease. And it worked, to an extent. Society was making some space to discuss sexual health. Sexual double standards, like those confronting Edith Everdeen, were becoming increasingly unsustainable with a socialized sexual health service. And certainly a lot of people who mass observation interviewed were on board with these efforts, like the young Scottish engineering foreman who was interviewed in a pub in Hammersmith. He said, I know some of my workers have venereal disease, they deny it and they won't go to a doctor. What you want is to show by films how bad it is. If people hate it, if they know how bad it is, they'd go to a doctor. But not everyone agreed. As you can see from the slide now, reflecting on the problem, a young woman from Poplar told her mass observation interviewer that it's a thing we don't know about, but we know about, but don't like to talk about. We British are snobs and don't have any truck with dirt of that kind. I saw a film at work, but it made everybody so embarrassed and shocked that they could make pictures like that. And there was a lot of men in the canteen. It was uncomfortable. I don't want to think about chaps in Egypt, and bear in mind this is during the Second World War and her husband's away in the Middle East, doing indecent things. We just couldn't. We think of them as brave and fighting. So, clearly there is a sense like there is an element of morale around this as well. Although VD health films were trying to reshape attitudes, they couldn't entirely overcome these long-standing beliefs that sexual knowledge was somehow dirty and corrupting. And this stigma, unfortunately, also shaped the care that people received from the clinics themselves. Clinics were intended, at least in theory, to be places where people could go voluntarily without fear of notification or stigma. But not everyone got the memo. Some local authorities refused initially to set up clinics, arguing that doing so would condone vice and constitute an abuse of charity. Others insisted, without any actual data, that venereal disease wasn't a problem in their local area. And it wasn't just local authorities. Many individual doctors also believed that the VD service encouraged vice. For example, in 1921, the gynecologist and suffragist Louisa Martindale questioned whether, quote, the thoughtful woman doctor would not think it wiser to spend such sums of money in improving the condition of innocent, necessitous men and women. As far as Martindale and many others were concerned, it was the infected person's own fault that they were in this mess, and any support from the state would only condone bad and reckless behavior. What Wilson Jameson would go on to euphemistically describe in his 1942 broadcast as irregular sexual relationships. This type of moralizing, which we more often associate with the Victorians, also shaped the official sexual health advice available through the VD clinics, where abstinence was prioritized as the only acceptable surefire way to avoid infection. Facilities for medical prophylaxis, so things like douches, disinfection, and condoms, were widely criticized as state-endorsed vice. But it didn't just stop with moralizing high-handedness. The clinics also engaged in various forms of subtle and not so subtle coercion. And this job fell often to the almoners, who were an early form of social worker. In the mixed economy of healthcare in interwar Britain, almoners were responsible for determining how much an individual should contribute to the cost of their own healthcare. But in the VD service, where care was free at the point of use, almoners undertook helpful follow-ups with patients who cut short their treatment. They, along with nurses and doctors, became part of a complex surveillance infrastructure, and the people who were most often surveilled were working-class women. If a woman stopped coming for treatment, she would receive a generic printed flyer, requesting that she attend the clinic as soon as possible. And these flyers didn't include any identifying information about the clinic or the reason why she was being asked to attend. But if this first communication went unanswered, a second personalized letter was sent offering to discuss her reasons for non-attendance, and it also warned that a health visitor would come to her home if no response was forthcoming. Now, these measures were never legislated. The Ministry of Health was not sent patients' personal information, and neither were most women compelled to persist with treatment. Nonetheless, such coercion and surveillance was troublingly reminiscent of the Victorian Contagious Diseases Acts. And these acts had, during the time, given police in the areas where the acts were operational full discretionary power to arrest anyone that the police thought might be soliciting. And despite government mandates that the interwar VD service not be used to target specific groups or compromise patient confidentiality, and despite specific insistence on the part of the Royal Commissioners that no return to the Contagious Diseases Acts be considered as part of the VD service, the way the VD service operated in practice did allow professionals to exert influence over their patients' private lives. Through follow-up letters, health visits, infection monitoring, and programs of sexual health education, the clinics became central in a wider strategy of social and moral control. Almoners insisted that this was nothing more than friendly and sympathetic support for distressed, unmarried mothers and harassed housewives. But helpful reminders and follow-up visits to family homes suggests that subtle coercion was also part of the modus operandi. And this type of coercive care persisted well into the post-war period, except it wasn't just working-class women anymore who were singled out for censure and surveillance. Historically associated with prostitution and the white working classes, venereal disease was now becoming linked discursively to new Commonwealth migrants, especially Black Caribbean men, as well as men who had sex with men within the wider British population. They were now also increasingly targeted as problematic vectors for disease. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, sexual health stigma among LGBTQ+ and ethnically minoritized communities was compounded by the violence of homophobia and racism. The shame of venereal disease intersected with internalized shame about same-sex desire and the ferocity with which society vilified mixed-race relationships. Post-war racialized narratives of sexual danger became popular fodder for the press, vilifying Black Caribbean men as a danger to young white women and by extension the nation itself. And in these narratives, venereal disease was part of a bigger threat to white identity and the fabric of British society. Stereotypes about Black sexual health, which were embedded in eugenic and colonial tropes, were weaponized by anti-immigrant nationalists to rhetorically link Britishness and healthiness to ideas of whiteness, while also presenting Black migrants as a burden on the NHS. All the while glossing over the fact that venereal disease had long been endemic in Britain, because health authorities and state authorities were often reluctant to acknowledge that the majority of VD infections that were being recorded among new Commonwealth migrants were contracted after arriving in Britain, not before. As we've seen in Nigel Farage's recent efforts to whip up support for immigration controls by playing on HIV stigma and tropes about dangerous migrants, such narratives are still undermining sexual health and well-being. Post-war anti-immigrant rhetoric was melding sexual health stigma with racialized ideas about predatory Black sexuality and gendered assumptions about the vulnerability of white women, especially young middle-class women. And here we see a continuation of some of the eugenic tropes that were favored by Victorian writers like Grant. When post-war newspapers broached the subject of Black sexual health, they often forewent hard epidemiological evidence in favor of stereotypes about Black men preying on white women, fathering mixed-race children and spreading disease. At the same time that health authorities and the popular press were focusing so intently on infection rates among Black migrants, they were also systematically excluding all non-white patients from studies that might have helped identify the socioeconomic factors that were contributing to disease prevalence within those communities. And the reasons given for this exclusion were variations on the claim that racial differences were insurmountable, leading to unworkable clinical investigations. And the consequence of this racialized exclusion meant that opportunities were lost for understanding the social and structural determinants that may have exacerbated sexual health inequalities and disparities. The sexual health of Black patients was placed firmly on the periphery. Little effort was made to understand how racial inequalities exacerbated sexual health stigma, increased the risks of venereal disease, limited the availability of care, or undermined long-term health outcomes. And the same sorts of exclusionary practices also affected LGBTQ sexual health experiences in this period. The historian Richard McKay has mapped the ways in which queer men, for example, navigated such exclusion, adapting health guidance and developing strategies to protect themselves from venereal disease and state interference. Marginalized from mainstream healthcare, even after the decriminalization of homosexuality, these men developed their own networks of support beyond the gaze and the reach of institutional medicine. But this activity in the periphery, this existing beyond formalized health structures, also meant that, as in every other chapter thus far in Britain's sexual health saga that we've looked at today, there is a frustrating lack of first-hand accounts of personal sexual health experiences, especially in those decades before AIDS. Unfortunately, there is no one living today who was an adult attending a VD clinic in the interwar years. So historians have to rely far more heavily on other types of historical evidence, like fiction, like the VD health films, to try and understand the experiences of people during those decades. But for the later post-war period, we can and should be turning to things like oral histories, which have the potential for finely grained studies that can nuance people's experiences according to factors like class, gender, ethnicity, and sexuality. It's this type of research that offers historians the best possible chance of mapping the lived experiences of sexual health. And these types of oral history collections are being compiled for a diverse range of people and organizations who lived through the AIDS crisis. But we also need now to turn our attention to those earlier decades before AIDS, before things changed so dramatically and tragically. So, in conclusion, what have we seen? Lived experiences of sexual health were, as you'd expect, heavily contingent on each person's intersectional identity. But overlaid onto these were more universal sets of experiences that were the product of fundamental social tensions between the growing demand that sexual health be brought into the light and the persistent, intractable efforts to keep it hidden away. Between efforts to protect people by arming them with knowledge and the persistent desire to protect their innocence by maintaining the ignorance of issues that were seen to be corrupting. Between the insistence that certain groups were biomedical dangers to society and the fact that social inequality and prejudice was so often the root cause of high infection rates. What has emerged from all of this is the indisputable importance of socialized medicine and the vital role it has played in improving sexual health and helping to break down the enormous stigma that has surrounded sexual health in the past. Britain's socialized sexual health services, delivered first through the VD service and later through the NHS, helped to counteract the shocking inequalities in medical paternalism that we've seen in this paper. It was by no means a complete solution. It wasn't perfect, but it did go a long way towards improving things for a lot of people. The deliberate, systematic exclusion of women from their own care is difficult to sustain in a nationalised health service, where doctors are not subject to market pressures or to coercion from patients' families. Likewise, people were finding that they had greater choice in the care that they received. They could, at least in theory, move from one clinic to another if they felt that they were being treated inadequately, unethically, or unfairly. They could choose to receive care in a clinic far away from their community, thereby helping to try and reduce some of the stigma of clinic attendance. And they were no longer beholden to the condescension of charitable institutions who previously could withhold care and shame people in the name of Christian morality. The VD service, as I said, was by no means perfect, but its infrastructure and the principles of care it introduced, not least the aim to break down the stigma of venereal disease, has had a radical impact on Britain's health and well-being. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Anne. Brilliant talk and rich and going a lot of, and really impressive the amount of time that you kind of covered without losing the fine-grained detail. So thank you very, very much indeed. I have questions. I'm sure other people do. We've got two spaces to navigate. So Yao is going to keep an eye on who in our virtual space would like to ask the question, and I should keep an eye on who would like to ask the question here. So can I open it up straight away? Ina.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. I really enjoyed that. Can I just ask, one of the sources that you were talking about was this interview with the doctor who was kind of saying, well, no, I'm not telling this person that she might have venereal disease. I just wouldn't. But I thought what was really interesting about that was the line of questioning, because it seemed to me that the interviewer was actually quite shocked at that response. Do you think? Who was that? What was
So there were a series of commissioners. So this was testimony given before the Royal Commission, and he was being asked, I think, by Frederick Mott, who was he was also a doctor, and there was by this point sort of on the cusp of the First World War, there was disagreement over how much information you should give your patients. Because the idea of informed consent is still really quite nascent in this period, and especially when you have sort of dependents like women in a system where their husband or their father is paying the doctor's fees. It's the husband whose interests you are working towards. Certainly, there is a lot more willingness among male doctors in this period to conceal this information from women. I've not come across a female doctor who is prepared to do this. They're all very outspoken in their insistence that women need the right, they have the right to know this, and they have to know this for their own well-being and the family's well-being. it's difficult to sort of map this cultural trend because all the information we have has come down to us through published medical texts. So it's difficult to judge how much of that was being taken on board by the clinicians who were reading those texts. You sometimes see a little bit of this conversation happening in letters to the editor of things like the BMJ, where doctors say, you know, it's not really good to keep this information from women, but mainly it's an argument to help like ease the way for clinical treatment, not because they have a fundamental moral right to know, but it just makes your job easier as a doctor if they understand what they're doing, so they don't try and counteract your efforts to cure them. But that's the extent of the discussion that I've been able to find in the published material.
Yeah, interesting. Just seemed really interesting that the person who was asking the question really asked again that he really wouldn't say anything. So that already seemed to be pushing against, I think, something, right? An assumption that maybe kind of, would you really not, you know, that already kind of reveals some.
I think it's because there were other witnesses who were giving evidence, and they'd already given written evidence, and this was a follow-up questioning of their written evidence. So they knew that this was an issue. But there were other people giving evidence who were very much absolutely not what I withhold this information from women. So it could have been that in response to what had already been presented in the Royal Commission, because this is quite a way through. Something like 26,000 questions. So this is about halfway. So we'd already had quite a lot of witnesses giving evidence by this point. So it's possible that it was in response to something that had already been discussed earlier on in the proceedings.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I think that was really fascinating material, and it's also really incredible how so much of it, even kind of earlier accounts of medical encounters, still clinical encounters, kind of somehow feel to still resonate in experiences of sexual health clinics today in some way. But my question is with regards to something you said towards the end around sources. You were talking about groups like men have sex with men, and specifically for the AIDS crisis, and I was immediately thinking about gay magazines that kind of really boom around, well, not boom, but started being produced from the late 60s onwards. This the more kind of, you know, erotic or dirty magazines. And I don't know, but you see a lot of that kind of I guess, amateur or subcultural kind of health advice appearing in magazines from the 60s onwards in the US and in Germany that I've seen. Are you kind of looking at that kind of source as well, you know, like letters, you know, little ads, people writing about, even also kind of romantic fiction that deals may touch on that?
Well, everything and anything that we can find. And using that alongside oral histories that we're collecting, hopefully you're going to be able to collect in this period. The project's still quite new. And yeah, you're right that those sorts of, I was like, I don't know specifically about that group of magazines, but agony aunt columns as well, and stories that are being written in response to problems that seem to be quite pervasive within the communities that they're writing for. So trying to read between the lines of those sorts of textual accounts as well.
Because I think there's also the interesting thing that I was looking at the previous project, which is really at the cusp of the kind of the last year of the AIDS crisis, but also how that's actually somehow also kind of complicates the narrative that gay men are kind of finding it for themselves, because in those kinds of publications it took a few years or even for them to say AIDS. because they didn't want to. We don't want to. We want to turn you on. We don't want to kind of engage with that thing. And that kind of surprised me a bit to see that, it was not just Reagan in the US or whatever that took so many years to even say it. I mean, gay men in these magazines weren't talking about it. That makes an interesting, it complicates a lot the kind of that narrative of, do people want the knowledge, do people don't want that knowledge?
Yeah.
Is it just about the activists or the people really involved, or what about everyone else?
And it's also about, how, if at all, are people sort of compartmentalizing the way they think about sexual encounters, sexual desire, and like the consequences of that. It's I have no firm answers at the moment.
It's really nice.
But yeah, it'd be great to talk more about your work with those sorts of magazines.
I'm going to come in because I think there is something that ties both of these things. It's the questions of what do people know and who's telling them, and what are they hearing, and what are they doing with that knowledge, and how complex some of those interactions might be. And if we go right back to 1911, all that time period, if Simon Treasure is right, and you've got like a third of people wandering around the UK infected with either gonorrhea or syphilis, that is absolutely huge. And I know that's one of the things that people find quite surprising about Simon Treasurer's work, is that it's surprisingly huge. So therefore, are we looking at a large population who are aware and not talking, or do they just not know? And if they really don't know, why do they not know? What are the processes? And within that, so we're talking very much about how doctors might well protect women from this knowledge. Are they also protecting men? Or is it actually even more that people are protecting each other? So that I'm envisaging that if you actually were in a doctor's surgery, there might be, the doctor might become testing, like, what am I going to tell you? How are you reacting to what I'm telling you so far? And I get to this because I was interviewing somebody who I'm pretty sure was treated for a venereal disease in the 1940s. But the material I got was very kind of confusing, and I couldn't work out, and I had to spend enough time looking at it because I wasn't really thinking about this, but I couldn't work out whether he was essentially trying to tell me about his life and didn't really want to talk about this, so he was like going twists and turns so that I was pushing and that he was deliberately trying to like not do that to me. Or did he half know but not fully know, and was himself wanting to keep it from himself, not, like lots of things we know, we don't really want to confront that we know them. So we find ways of negotiating with ourselves, and telling ourselves our own narrative that makes us happy, makes us comfortable with what is happening to us. Or, was his interaction with his doctor constrained, and that was stuff that the doctor knew that wasn't really revealed. And once you get into a kind of post-penicillin world, it's very, very easy to have somebody come with suspected syphilis, they get some penicillin, it's all done and dusted. There's actually not very high cost in not telling people. I suspect it's more of a kind of collusion that you work out.
And I think there is definitely,
you're all in it together.
I think there's definitely that element of working out how is this person sitting in front of me going to respond if I tell them outright, you have syphilis, you have gonorrhea. And I think definitely in the earlier period, doctors do talk about this in sort of helpful manuals for other doctors, where you have to approach each case in like basically use your instincts, which become finely honed as you go like forward in your career. And work out, is me telling this person that they have syphilis going to throw them completely off the rails, and are they then going to like disappear from my practice and I'm never going to see them again? And if that's the case, how do I break this news in a way that will keep them coming back for treatment, because it's like, it's not, at that point, it's not just the injections of penicillin, it's a much more lengthy and invasive and distressing treatment. And I think also there was a real concern of like, they'd start off by saying, do you have a family? No, you don't. Are you planning to get married? And like having these tick boxes of questions, and if they answer in a certain combination of ways, then like, right, we have to be very forceful because you're about to get married and you've got syphilis, no messing around here, you cannot get married. That's that sort of thing. Because this is also the time of year that very big eugenic belief that venereal disease or syphilis is like a hereditary disease par excellence, and we're going to bring down the health of the nation if we allow these people to get married. And it's often men that they're having these conversations with. And I did sort of touch on this a little bit in the paper. I think, to be honest, that there were lots of women who knew what was going on, but there just wasn't the ability there to articulate it. You know, you've got doctors like me, and he's talking from a French perspective, but people like Jonathan Hutchinson in Britain are saying very similar things. That, you know, there are certain conventions that women are expected to conform to, and when you come into the doctor's surgery, if you say, right, I know I have syphilis, what are you going to do to get me better? Then the doctor's like, well, you're not playing ball, you know, you steered away from the accepted script, and now we have to like bring you back to that script. So there are certain conventions that you have to fall into, and I think a lot of that was going on. But the frustrating thing is we just don't have a lot of records for it, because it's all written by doctors, unfortunately.
Right to that.
Do you have a point that kind of follows up?
Mine too, maybe go first.
I'm just kind of, again, about these unspoken things that we don't know because they remain unspoken. And so, you know, we talked a bit about how the assumption is that men got syphilis, passed it on to their wives, and their wives then didn't get an explanation for where this came from, what it is, but you know, there must be cases where the women got syphilis, and then to what extent does that narrative actually kind of work for them to, you know, get syphilis, pass it on to their male partners, and then say, oh, actually, I don't know what this is, I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
I'm so innocent. What? Who, me? But that's quite an interesting way of telling that story, then, isn't it? And speaks of a kind of agency via buying into this narrative of innocence.
And again, frustratingly, a lot of the texts are being written by men. The earliest medical text about venereal disease written by a woman that I've been able to find was a eugenic doctor called Arabella Cornelius from 1895, and it's just a very melodramatic sort of New Woman novel-esque account written up in the British Medical Journal. But a lot of doctors do talk about this, but it's almost always couched in a woman has been married, her first husband gave her a venereal disease, the first husband dies, she then remarries, is she safe to remarry? And it's always that sort of scenario, not she's had sex outside marriage or she's had an extramarital sexual liaison and now she's a threat to her family and her children. And I don't know whether it's because it's not considered to be acceptable subject matter for these medical textbooks, or whether it just genuinely did not occur to these men that women in that particular social class would do this. I think it's probably a combination of both. But then to say that, you know, they talk about lots of very other controversial things. I mean, they don't talk, for example, about homosexual sexual liaisons openly, but they will talk about lots of patients, male patients, who are presenting with sores, like anal sores, for instance, and saying, you know, I have no idea how these venereal sores ended up in that location. And it's like, I'm pretty sure you know, but you're not being like, and I know that Jeffress, who worked at Queen Mary hospital, like one of the clinics in London, mind blank, I can't remember which one, but he was very outspoken in the need to treat, before decriminalization, to treat men who have sex with men openly and to not shame and shun, because you're just going to drive infection and vulnerable people underground. But he is unusual, and certainly in like previous generations of doctors, I haven't come across doctors who are talking about that openly. So I think they're projecting certain expectations and certain societal conventions into their work.
I suppose is that also where your sources will be really interesting, because if you're also looking at literature, I mean, I'm sure there'll be lots of fantastic, feminist readings of the Heavenly Twins, or what that might get at the different perspective of that kind of what is the function of that story of innocence in those texts, and how it's kind of female agency negotiated, or sexual agency.
And there's also, this is on the cusp of bacteriology, or bacteriology is still quite new as a field, and the assumption that once a woman has syphilis, it's like implanted in her womb, and it's like the soil is rotten now, and men can be treated, but you never quite know if there's like a lingering venereal taint in there somewhere if you marry a venereal disease. So it's also like that's also like a very like a message that's running through a lot of the medical literature as well. It's like just a warning to anyone who's thinking of marrying a woman who's been married before. Just be careful.
Yeah, I mean, and I was also really interested in what that kind of about stoicism, or that pretend you don't know, and what's happening and what that serves. And I mean, I hear it through this idea of obviously this being some kind of way of the kind of the focus on marriage and family life. It's really about the kind of the life of a particular idea, like citizenship, right? And it's like sexual citizenship and the family. And I was thinking about that Margot Kanye, The Straight State, which is a book about the US and sexuality in the state, in the US, it's not Britain, but there's this idea that this kind of concern around the life of the family eventually infecting something wrong with the sexual life of the family unit, really infecting the life of the state. And I was hearing a lot of that. Somehow that resonates a lot. And there's also this sense again, from the US, around early feminist debates on abortion and pro-life positions, that ultimately is this kind of balance between a fear between your own autonomy, but also a fear of losing something that you rely on, so the husband or the breadwinner. And I wonder if there's a sense of that in that stoicism too, of these women that they know way too well what's going on, but they're also pragmatic, and actually where would they get what they get from this marriage or whatever if they didn't take. It's better to ignore it and continue to kind of administer this kind of life, that like play their cards in the best way they can, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
No, just that, which is also speaking to this idea of, okay, what agency do I have in this circumstance? In a kind of patriarchal family relationships. I know well what my husband does with, I don't know, the fallen woman next door or something like that, but how can I exist in this circumstance as best as I can?
Yeah. I think you're right. There's definitely an element of that, like this is a sense of you're stuck. Yeah. So even if you said something, nothing will change. You might, all you'll do is end up making your doctor uncomfortable, and that could then affect the way that you will treat it. So you sort of play along and say, right, we both know that I know, but I'm going to pretend that I don't know in order to facilitate an effective solution to this problem. There are cases, and I appreciate these are very, very unusual cases, because they're usually among the very affluent and sort of titled, like aristocracy. Divorce cases that we have recorded in divorce courts of women who are suing for either a divorce or like a legal separation from a husband who has given her venereal disease, and it's cited as one of the reasons alongside adultery. There's adultery, it has to be adultery and something to get a divorce in this period, if you're a woman. And they say he's been unfaithful, but he's also been cruel by giving me a venereal disease. And but they are very few and far between. You do see some of these cases coming forward in the interwar years. So this whole issue around confidentiality is reinvigorated with the VD service and doctors saying, you know, what happens if a VD officer is asked to give evidence in a divorce trial because a woman is trying to leave her husband. And also there's this real sense of, if you are unsuccessful with your quest for a divorce, or if you try and leave without a divorce, you can be forced back into the family home. So there is a real sense that the legal mechanisms, the way that society is ordered, are not in your favor, and you're navigating your way through the least worst option rather than an ideal solution.
That turns into a real kind of Foucauldian, I guess, understanding of how these mechanisms are operating. That actually the level of like actual agency or autonomy that women could potentially forge within a very precarious relationship can actually be quite
Conditional agency.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we all need, like, I certainly, as a historian, need to be more mindful of when I'm reading my sources, like what exactly are the social pressures, legal pressures, the financial constraints on these people in these particular set of circumstances. I know we've got some questions, well, I've got some notifications in the chat. Are there any questions? Okay.
Ina, go on. Ask a question.
I think something that I didn't really sort of touch on here, because it didn't really seem like it was part of the bigger discussion around shame and sex. There's a lot more that I used to get through. Was returning to that idea of women, you know, being the ones who are sort of potentially bringing infection into the home. I know that Hallie Rubin holds the 5, I think in the chapter on Elizabeth Stride, she talks about that. And again, it's this sense of like the experience with the oral history, you know, there are suggestions and allusions to it, but we never quite know. We're like reading against the grain of the material to try and understand this. So at one point, Hallie mentions that Stride had made up this story about how she'd ended up with a damaged palate, soft palate. And I mentioned to Hallie at the time when we were talking about this was that actually that tells me that she had tertiary syphilis, combined with a whole lot of other things that were happening to her at the time, because that's like it eats away at the soft palate, and she needed some way of explaining it in a way that wasn't morally damaging, because she was trying to re-enter society to be a respectable woman at this point. So it's those sorts of really little snippets that we have at our disposal, trying to work out, you know, what's going on here, how are you negotiating your situation to try and present yourself in a particular way that's going to be advantageous to you.
I'm sorry, you can ask. I think that I'm just kind of still fascinated by this, that you're bringing in literary sources as well, which I think is really what makes this project really, really, really exciting to me. As someone who kind of approaches this kind of topic from a more literary or cultural studies perspective. And I just see how all of these kind of questions that we're asking, I think by engaging with that kind of, you know, literary criticism and literary narrative readings of some of these texts that aren't maybe necessarily literary, I think that will be really interesting to see what happens when, you know, when you bring that in. I think that's when these questions around agency and voice will be really, really interesting. And I'm not just saying that because I'm writing a book on that.
But I'm wondering whether the literary can also like reinforce some of the things that some of the silences as well. So, you know, we go to the literary because we think there are truths that the historical material is hiding from us because it's caught up, and that there might be some kind of blunt confrontation in the literary because of the fictional nature means you're not dealing with real people who are experiencing the but at the same time, does the literary not also provide us other ways of reading the same stories, and particularly with syphilis, it's quite easy to hide syphilis. You know, it's quite easy to categorize a blind child as not as just a blind child, not somebody who's got conventional syphilis. So it's quite easy to talk about a case of tertiary syphilis that ends in death as just a form of mental psychosis. Or whatever. So that it gives you, syphilis gives you lots and lots of different, perfectly acceptable stories to account for its trajectory. And so maybe the literary also gives us really, really rich tellings of
the hiding. It's really interesting that Brand never actually names disease in Heavenly Twins. It's always like, but she's writing almost as if there is an implicit understanding, and she's writing for women. So this is what also reinforces to me that they know, but they can't say that they know, because she's writing in this sort of unknowable way about a disease that she cannot name. I can't remember if Doyle named it, but certainly Brand does not name it. And she doesn't talk in any real visceral detail about the physical devastation of venereal disease. It's not clear whether it's gonorrhea or syphilis, but I kind of think it's syphilis because it's like there's a congenital element to the sickly child in the story. And she's always talking about sniffles or just feeling fatigued and just like looking like she's wasting away. So it almost feels like a consumptive. She's describing it almost like a consumptive disease, but she's talking about it not being right since marriage. So that's the key that we know it's a venereal disease. So it's more like you go, and I use them in conjunction with other sources from medical literature at the time. You go to the medical literature to try and find out how are doctors, how are people talking in that space about the more devastating physical impacts of venereal disease. And those stories are very harrowing. I'm not convinced they're always genuine stories, like the one about Arabella Keneally, who I mentioned earlier. It feels heavily fictionalized. There could be a kernel of truth in there somewhere, but it does feel like a very sensationalized story. But she's really going into quite explicit detail about what's happening to this person who has, had several miscarriages, is hemorrhaging, there's blood everywhere, there's this child who is clearly congenitally syphilitic, and she tears up her prescription because she can't bear another monstrous degenerate to be born from this woman who's been infected by her husband with syphilis. And then other cases of a woman who's had tertiary syphilis, who has tertiary syphilis, and the doctor who's gone to see her is describing this ungodly smell in the room, and like all of her teeth are falling out, she's blind, and those sorts of things. So it's obviously a very different audience, but again, it's that idea that for doctors it's acceptable to have this, to recognize these sorts of visceral cases, but for the public consumption, it's not. And Edward Gibson does the same thing in his play that deals with syphilis. It's all very euphemistic.
I mean, we'll continue talking to dinner, I'm sure. But I'm not a historian, and I'd like to say that just so I can excuse myself from any disciplinary errors on that. But I think there is an interesting. I think as someone who broadly places himself in cultural studies, I think there's a kind of a maybe the issue or the advantage of these sources, literary sources, or visual sources, or what I've done like pornography, as historical sources, maybe that they are actually not the kinds of sources that they don't give us the information that would expect from other kinds of documents, but that they give us something that is about, like in the example that you were talking with the novel of Grant, that has some sense of like structural feeling or kind of something that is, structurally feeling a sense or a kind of imaginary around something that we wanted to think about. And maybe that becomes a bit too maybe fluffy and uncertain for historians, but that to me is really interesting because it's giving you a kind of an affective dimension to the thing that the kind of oftentimes a document, official document or a medical document may not give you, right?
Yeah.
But then again, I don't know.
But I think for subjects like this, we need to embrace the uncertainty and just like, I mean, it's part of what makes, for me, it's part of what makes the subject interesting to study. But we have to accept it and work with it, not try and find ways around it.
So it doesn't count. I mean, just the fact that she does not mention syphilis, and yet there's all this about syphilis and how it is, at least maybe not any specific experience, but how it is thought to be felt when she's writing. I think that is incredible as my experience.
I think that's what's become so interesting with the interwar shift in the way that literary productions are organized. Is like they are naming. So there is that alone, I think, is a really important shift in the fact that they are now prepared to say publicly the word syphilis, the word gonorrhea, and not just in medical context. This is something that everyone can go to the cinema and see. Now, I mean, Tim Boone talks about this in his work, about how extensively these films were shown. We do have accounts of them being put on for general audiences, and those general audiences were not gender-specific audiences. So we know that women saw Trial for Marriage, which was aimed at men, and we know that men saw ones like A Test for Love, which is designed for women. So yeah, I think it is stimulating those bigger conversations. So people would have known that venereal disease was an issue, but now they have space to talk about it more publicly.
And there's also but the not naming, I think doesn't. I think it's interesting when we assume that naming something is the more powerful thing to do. I mean, I think it's interesting, and not that she doesn't name syphilis, but the reader, she reads and knows it's syphilis without being given the name, makes the reader potentially feel empowered and clever and informed.
Yeah.
And that's a really interesting. That's a really interesting relationship between text and readership that actually makes you feel more powerful because you know something that you think other people might not.
Yeah, no, sorry, I memeant in terms of like public health,
Yeah.
like the generation of sort of public health reform, the naming of it is an important step. But I do take your point, like I think you're right that there's this sense of I'm with it. I know what she's talking about in this, and I am clued in because it's part of this sort of unspoken language that builds a sense of sort of like familiarity and connection.
And it allows us also to add agency, to the women who are not naming, or they're going, they know what, like they are navigating over it, they make it completely clear. We all know what's going on, but I'm going to phrase it in this way.
Yeah.
And so it's not simply that I can't say it, but it's it's a choice not to say it.
And I did say about not having the vocabulary to name it openly. But I think a lot of people did. But having the vocabulary, as you say, Kate, to frame it in a way that is necessary or works for them.
It's also you need to name it and be more explicit about it. If you are going to take a pragmatic policy view about it, if you're going to actually change things for people, it has to be out in the open, it has to be exposed. It's all very well people understanding it in their own terms.
Yeah.
But if you want to actually affect social change, it has to be out there and hold that debate, which is why what you say about the venereal disease service during the war was so vital.
And those posters as well, there's like a whole range of them. A lot of them are about men, stay away from these women. She may look pretty, but she's got syphilis. And then
That's a classic.
Yeah, the easy girlfriend one.
But she's actually.
And then there's also one like women stay away from dance halls. All of these men have venereal disease, and all of these men were remarkably like Tyrone Powell. But, you know, that aside. Yeah, I think those as well, because, you know, you have limited scope for the films, but posters put up. You can put posters in very strategic places, like, you know, public lavatories where people would see them, or train stations, or those sorts of things. Yeah, I think naming it, as you say, for public health purposes, as I said before, is like a really important step change. And even with the sort of literature of the time, it's now being named, but that's introducing a whole other range of like conventions that you have to then play along to in order, like you present yourself in a certain way when you go to a BD clinic because you've seen it presented this way on film, or it's been discussed this way among your peers. So, you know, there's still those like unspoken conventions, but they're shifting in the 20th century.
They did so. Sorry, I go on. I wish I
No, I was just saying questions that popped in my head. I was wondering with sort of films and things, was there any of the stigma attached to sort of actors like playing someone with these kind of?
That's a good question.
No.
I haven't found anything like that. I mean, in terms of, again, in a lot of, in Trial for Marriage, Henry names the diseases, but the patients themselves often talk in these sort of more Victorian style euphemistic ways about the disease. And it does feel very similar to things like Ghosts as a play. And certainly the play itself, Ghosts, in the earlier period by Henry Gibson was it was nation, but it was also like vilified as this like open sewer on the British stage sort of thing. And I haven't found any information. As I said, Tim Boone's done a lot more work on this, and he may have more information about this in his work about the responses to the films. They were generally thought to be fascinating, but I don't know what repercussions there were for the actors themselves. I mean, they made a lot of them. So yeah, but I haven't seen, like, for example, there's no one in these films that I would then go like recognize in other films that are more sort of like well known at the time. And I've seen a lot of films from this period. Saying that, you know, it's difficult to judge because you don't know what happens to one of these actors.
Well, we've definitely stretched your time as long as we could. And had a very, very good discussion, but I think we can draw it, you know, to a nice end with, you know, triumphal celebration of the unknowability of history and how we like
That's celebration of
that
sexual
part.
health.
And thank you to everyone who joined us online.
Yes,
Yes.
thank you very much. A very large, if quiet audience.
Yes.
Because we were so loud.
Sorry. Wonderful, thank you very, very much, Anne.
Thank you.
Do you want to turn the recording off? Yes.